You may recall the name Esther Rocket from episode 2, season 3 of this podcast, which was all about universal medicine, Serge Ben Hayen's esoteric healing cult in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales. Esther has been blogging about the more alarming aspects of Serge's modalities since 2012, and he sued her for defamation in 2015. The case went to trial in 2018, and in an incredible David and Goliath tale, Esther's defence proved that the bulk of the defamatory claims found to have been conveyed in her writings were true. Esther has recently published a book about this battle, and it is riveting reading. Welcome to Let's Talk About Sects, a podcast about cults around the world. I'm your host, Sarah Steele. Before we get into the episode, a content warning. This podcast deals with issues that some people may find disturbing, related to emotional abuse and controlling behaviours. This episode also includes mentions of molestation and sexual predation and sexual abuse. Please use your discretion as to whether this will be suitable for you and those around you who may be listening too. Universal Predator by Esther Rocket is described on its cover as a lone woman's fight to expose Serge Ben Hayen and his universal medicine cult, the inside story. And it really is an incredible story. Esther was kind enough to give me some time to talk about her book and about what drives her to continue exposing a charlatan when those who should be protecting the public seem incapable of doing so. Esther, you've written an amazing book, and as someone with an ongoing interest in the subject, there's a lot in there that I didn't know about. I'm going to assume that many people listening to this interview will have heard the Let's Talk About Sects episode or have some general knowledge about universal medicine. But for those who haven't, can you give us a quick overview of who Serge Ben Hayen is and how you originally came into his orbit?
Okay, well, first I recommend that your listeners go and listen to that episode for a start. But Serge Ben Hayen is a former tennis coach. He was born in 1963 in Uruguay and he migrated to Australia as a child. And he was a tennis coach in Sydney until the early 90s, and he moved to northern New South Wales. And he transitioned out of tennis coaching into becoming a self-styled healer and then the great guru that we know now as Serge Ben Hayen. And I came across him in 2004. I was in the Byron Bay area, so at that stage Serge was living on the outskirts of Lismore in Gunnellabar, running his healing practice. And I just went along for some healing at the recommendation of a friend. And, had a pretty uncomfortable experience with him. And at the time suspected he could have the beginnings of a cult leader. You know, he seemed to have those aspirations that he wanted to become a cult leader. And some years later, in 2012, I read in the newspaper, after having heard nothing about him for a long time, that he was telling people he was the reincarnation of Leonardo da Vinci and other people, Pythagoras and some other luminaries from the past, King Imhotep, and that he had a following of 2,000 across the world. So he had built up a big following in Australia. He had started an organisation or business called Universal Medicine. And he also had quite a few followers mostly in Europe.
So I would recommend everyone read your book to find out all the details. But briefly, from there, how did you come to be defending a civil lawsuit brought against you by Serge?
Well, that really came from that first experience I had with Serge, or the very first experiences I had. As I said, they were pretty uncomfortable. And he tried this sleazy maneuver on me. He called it an ovarian reading under the guise of healing. He had this idea that my ovaries were going to tell him things. And you can read all about that. I don't really want to go much further into it anymore these days. I don't really like talking about it. So I had this dirt on him, but I was really concerned about what he was doing, because he was practicing this hands-on healing in his treatment room in his home. But he'd started a lot of workshops, so training esoteric healers. He'd begun this business, because that's quite lucrative, training healers. It's much more lucrative than just treating one person at a time. So he'd worked out he could make a lot of money this way and develop a following from training people. But I was really concerned about his, problems with personal boundaries. So having had this bad experience with Serge, I had dirt on him. And when I heard also that he had this huge following, and I knew from the time that I met him that he was surrounded by women, this caused me a lot of concern. And I began digging. So as I dug, I found all sorts of damaging information about him that scared me a lot. He was also developing a reputation for damaging families, for breaking up families and relationships. So I began blogging everything that I could find out about him. And clearly he didn't like that, and neither did his flock of followers. And at first, they tried to shut me down. The lawsuit was sort of their last resort. So they tried lots of things to stop me from publishing this damaging stuff about Serge. They tried all sorts of harassment, I suppose. And in the end, Serge filed for defamation in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. And after 3 years of sort of legal tussling, that went to trial in 2018. So really, yes, I got into trouble for defamation through my blogging about Serge. Oh, and universal medicine.
And just so that people really understand the impact that this has had on your life, apart from the all-consuming nature of the defamation case itself, this affected your career, your mental health, and your finances to the point of declaring bankruptcy. And I think me and others are so amazed that you never gave up. But that's what so many of these cultic groups do. It's intimidate their opponents into silence. So how was it that you never became intimidated?
Yeah, that's a good question. I never was intimidated, and you're absolutely right about that. To me, I could never take Serge seriously for a start. I just thought he was a complete upstart. And when he tried this maneuver of ovarian reading on me, I was just totally outraged and really angry with him. So I was never afraid of him. And maybe that was it. Maybe I just couldn't take any of them seriously, even when they had this kind of squadron of in-house lawyers. In fact, I sometimes think that they were much more afraid of me than I ever was of them. I never was afraid of them, but they seem to be very intimidated by me. And I think that's just the power of having dirt on someone, on having information about people and not being afraid to share that information, to publicise it. So, no, I wasn't never afraid, but also I think it was the power of that outrage, that fear that I had for all of the people, all of the vulnerable people that this group was targeting. They were going after the weakest. They were going after, women with serious women's health disorders, including cancer, terminally ill patients, sexual abuse survivors, people with eating disorders, children. So no one was safe. And that passion, I guess, I had for protecting people, knowing that these people, their victims are defenceless, I think that was just powerful enough to override any sense of fear that I could have had, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to a related question that I had for you, which is a subject that's covered a lot in the book, and it's a question you've asked of yourself in a lot of different ways. And that's what drove you to continue to publish material related to the activities of universal medicine over so many years, in spite of the impact that it had on your own life.
Yeah, well, I think, for a start, it comes really naturally to me. Quite a few people ask me about it, but for me, it was never a choice. It was something that I couldn't not do. There was never a question of not exposing universal medicine. And just that problem of them going after vulnerable people, I just couldn't tolerate it. Also, when you think of children suffering, children that are afraid to go to sleep at night because they're frightened of spirits coming after them, and children being deprived of nutritious food, children crying from hunger because of this group, it's just so intolerable. And the more I found out about universal medicine, the more vindication I felt that I was doing the right thing in exposing them, that they had to be exposed. And that really overrode any personal concerns of my own. It's so much harder for me to understand why I got so little help. Like why this is something that I never expected, that I would be doing it alone or with so little help. There were so few people that were willing to say anything. And to this day, even now when it's completely safe to say really anything you want about universal medicine, you can call them a cult. It's perfectly legal to do so because it's been proven. You can call Serge a charlatan, a liar, and a pervert because we've proven it. So there's nothing to lose now in speaking out about universal medicine, and yet people are still afraid to do so. And I just cannot, for the life of me, get my head around it.
I'm going to read a quote from your book here. You wrote about being aware of Scientology's fair game policy, where detractors are targeted and harassed by devotees, and how some high demand groups attack their opponents. The quote is, "But I also knew that extremist groups rely on secrecy and intimidation to thrive, and in the absence of meaningful government regulation, media exposure is the most powerful weapon against them." So some of your blogging was driven by the fact that the bodies that are meant to protect the public hardly ever seemed to be able to take any real action against the activities of universal medicine or its devotees who were utilising Serge's unscientific methods within their own practices. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the variety of ways that you've tried to get official action taken and some of your wins and frustrations there?
Yeah, that's a really long story and it's still going. And the outcomes have been terrible. And that's another thing that I just still can't fathom. So in 2012, when I began blogging about Serge, and anyone who's read my blogs knows, and if you read the book, you'll find out that I blogged hundreds of posts, blog articles about Serge and universal medicine and all of their controversial activities. But at the same time, the blogging was never meant to be the main point of attack. The main point of attack was really to get something done about all of these health professionals that promote universal medicine. So they got a few dozen health professionals that were openly endorsing the group. And they form part of this huge structure of undue influence around universal medicine that's pulling vulnerable people in and keeping vulnerable people in the group. So at the very beginning, I began reporting them to authorities because I looked at the codes of conduct for the registered health professionals in Australia, and you would think from the codes of conduct that a registered health professional should not be promoting quackery. Well, not just quackery. A healing fraud that harms people is what universal medicine was proven in court to be. So we have this problem of health professionals like a GP, for example, endorsing esoteric breast massage, which is just really a type of invasive molestation and privacy invasion. And, a surgeon endorsing Serge's exorcisms, him doing these practices that are supposed to remove evil spirits from people. You've got a surgeon endorsing that and others. So I began reporting them to the appropriate authorities, and I've continued to do it up until last year. And the responses I've gotten along the way have been they're entitled to their beliefs and they're entitled to their opinions. But, I don't think that, put it this way, I think that our authorities have codes and laws that they could enact to do something about these health professionals, and they simply don't use them because they see it as a matter of religious belief. And it's not. It's a matter of these people having a professional association with a dangerous organisation that is a public health risk and a fraud that's ripping people off and is antisocial as well. So, for me, it's a no-brainer. The authorities should be able to do something about the health professionals that are endorsing universal medicine. I think that they could actually get them to completely disconnect from universal medicine, end any professional association, and that means with universal medicine, the organisation or the business, but also with its associates. So some of them are clustered in a business, for example, on the Gold Coast that is a provider to the NDIS, the Disability Insurance Scheme, which was operating out of a universal medicine premises. And AHPRA surely should be able to get them to disband and not work together. Anyway, so they look, to me, those health professionals, what I've been told by AHPRA is that this kind of personal judgment on the part of these health professionals doesn't necessarily have any bearing on their clinical practice. But I don't agree with that. I think that their personal judgment is completely suspicious. It needs to be, regarded with suspicion, and there needs to be something done about them. And it's not just their clinical practice. The authorities know very well that health professionals are influential people. They can influence members of the public who are not their patients.
I thought you very reasonably wrote one of your recommendations to the Healthcare Complaints Commission was that genital touching in healthcare settings be criminalised unless it's performed by a qualified worker for legitimate health or hygiene reasons. And you point out that is still not the case, which, I was astounded to read that no current legislation addresses sexual predation in treatment rooms.
Yeah, it's astonishing. It's astonishing. I've never understood it. And in that case, what I was referring to Serge's practices, because if you read my book, you'll find out that he was involved in this extremely controversial practice of touching the genitals of sexual abuse survivors, and he called it a healing for rape recovery. Now, that's... To me, I got into trouble. This is how I got sued for defamation, because I said that this was molestation and that he should be stopped from doing it. But of course, the health authorities did nothing about that either. The response I got to that, to a complaint about that practice of inappropriate touching under the guise of healing by someone who has no qualifications whatsoever, because Serge is totally unqualified. He didn't finish high school. But there he is calling himself universal medicine, which has a medical connotation, and treating vulnerable people like sexual abuse survivors who might not know that he doesn't have the necessary qualifications to be addressing their issues. So I complained about him, and the response from the Healthcare Complaints Commission was that we might not be able to prove that the clients didn't consent to this, what I call molestation, and refused to do anything about it. And of course, my reply to that, which got me absolutely nowhere, was that a client can't possibly consent to something that is deceptive, to a deceptive pretense at healing or therapy. So it's not legitimate therapy. They can't possibly consent to it. Anyway, that never got me anywhere. And so I made a recommendation to the Australian Health Ministers Advisory Council that there should be a specific legislation about this kind of touching that occurs in treatment settings, whether it's a registered or an unregistered health practitioner, and that any sort of genital touching should be outlawed unless there is a legitimate reason to do it, a medical reason to do it. And that has to be a hygiene reason, and that protects nurses and, other health workers who need to touch people for hygiene reasons, legitimate ones, or a legitimate medical reason that is approved by the professional board, for example, like the medical board, or it would have to be run past the chiropractic board or the physiotherapy board. So, look, I just will never understand the stance of Australian health regulators. They don't seem to be interested in protecting patients. They seem to be interested in protecting practitioners far more than patients, practitioners and professions. And it's a huge disappointment to me. I still get very cranky about it. You can probably hear it in my voice.
I think quite understandably so, and I guess also understandable how that continued to drive your blogging, because I think it's so important to note that at the same time you were trying to go through all the official channels that exist and were essentially hitting a brick wall most of the time. There were a few small wins in there, but a lot of lack of movement.
Yeah, just to finish that point, because you did ask me about that. And so I did say, the blogging was meant to be temporary. I didn't think I'd be blogging for years and getting sued and left in this position that I was going it alone, because really the media coverage was off and on. The media is very powerful. The media has to be powerful because the authorities aren't doing anything. I didn't think I would be in this position where the authorities did nothing at all. And it wasn't just the health authorities. I also went to the Office of Fair Trading about all of the deceptive claims. But, they won't do anything unless it's a client, somebody who's paid for the services, who makes the complaint. And Surge's clients, Universal Medicine clients, a lot of them don't know they've been deceived or are too ashamed to admit it and are never going to make that complaint. So they didn't do anything either. But anyway, I didn't think I'd be in that position where blogging was the only weapon I had. Publishing, writing letters. I didn't think I would be left alone like that, to go it alone.
And I think at the same time, because you were doing the blogging, you were then also receiving other information about other practices and things that were going on. You became privy to more information, and then that drove you to publish further. So it became a bit of a self-propagating machine.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I think probably what wasn't appreciated, by the time I started blogging in 2012, Surge had been operating. Universal Medicine had been operating for 12 years. So Surge started Universal Medicine in 1999. That's his business. And Universal Medicine is two things, really. It's a business. It's a corporation. But it's also this kind of religious movement. It refers to a group, a following that's clustered around Surge. So it had been operating for 12 years, doing a lot of business with no scrutiny. the media had never cottoned on, and I don't really understand why that is either, because there's recordings back in 2007 where Serge is talking about cult allegations. People were accusing him of a cult way back then, of being a cult. And so by the time I started doing the investigation, there was so much to be uncovered that nobody had touched on or had been intimidated away from investigating. And that was the problem. It was just one person just finding all of this stuff, just masses and masses of material, digging and digging, and, digging into the charity side, the money side, the sleaze, the antisocial side. I was just finding so much stuff, and it became almost a full-time occupation to be investigating them.
But I think that also speaks to you being a very certain type of person to be finding out all this stuff and to be so driven to actually continue to really want to do something about it, even after sort of hitting brick walls on so many different fronts. Like, I think there are so many groups that I'd love if they had an Esther Rocket going after them with the force that you continue to publish material on this group.
Yeah, it shouldn't be an Esther Rocket going after. It should never be left to an individual to do what I did. In some ways, I'm certainly doing more to protect the public from universal medicine than any authority in Australia, with their hundreds of millions of dollars in funding. I'm doing it with nothing, and ended up with nothing as well. So, it should never be individuals, but at the same time, I wish more individuals had taken the initiative and shown a bit more courage, because to me it's not that big a deal. I don't know. I can't allow harm to go on, to be aware of harm the way that I was. And I had dirt on Serge, there's no question. I couldn't just allow it to go on. I couldn't walk away from it. And I have never understood how other people can, to be honest. It's just seems completely foreign to me. I don't know why I'm so eccentric in that way.
Well, I think it's incredibly impressive, but I absolutely agree with you. It should never be down to an individual, and there's something going really wrong when it is. So I was just going to zoom back to your original encounter with Serge, and this is something that was brought up in the trial, was that you had an incredibly visceral response to some parts of his treatments. You wrote, "I'd writhe with tremors, hyperventilate, and at some points found myself speaking in tongues." That kind of reaction might sway others into thinking there was something to it all. I was just wondering where you thought that response was coming from in you at that time.
Yeah, maybe I'll contextualise a little bit, because a friend of mine had recommended I go see Serge, and this friend was an acupuncturist who I respected a lot. We'd studied a lot together. And I didn't like the idea. I wasn't interested in healers. I thought a lot of them were full of shit, They are. But my friend said it was interesting. He said I should go and try it because it was interesting. I was a lot more open-minded back then, so 20 years ago now, and I was willing to sort of experiment and try things. So I did go along, and I thought, okay, my friend says this is interesting. I'll go along with whatever Serge says within reason and see what happens, because I was very interested in the healing process. I was an acupuncturist back then. And so Serge, he undertook this hands-on healing. It was him just putting his hands on my body. It was usually my upper back or shoulders, and just holding his hands there for quite a while. But he would instruct me to empty my mind. And so this is what the technique was. And I didn't know much about trance induction at that time or hypnosis. I didn't really know how they worked, but I was open to it. I thought, well, what is this? What could it be? And so I followed the instructions and did the breathing. He also got me to slow the breathing down and empty the mind. Held his hands in those same positions for quite a while, and it would bring on these strong physical sensations. And they took a while to build, but they were really pretty extreme, so that by the time they peaked, I would be writhing around on the table and speaking in tongues, gibberish, and all sorts of things like that. So at the time, I didn't know what it was. I was interested in it, though. I thought, how is he doing this? How is he getting me to do this? And is this a spiritual experience, because I've always been interested in spirituality too. So that's why I kind of went to him. I ended up going to 3 of his sessions, and I went to one of his workshops as well to see how he was doing this technique, because I wanted to know more about it. But as far as thinking it was a legitimate or authentic spiritual experience, I didn't know, and I didn't think so. And by the time I finished with it too, because as you will read in the book, I wrote about the workshop and what happened at the workshop and my conclusions at the end of it after going through it all. And I concluded that it wasn't a spiritual experience. To me, it was pretty empty, actually. There was nothing to it. And, over the years I worked out, it's just a sort of a trance induction technique. But what concerned me was that many of the participants at these healing workshops where Serge was teaching these techniques, they seemed to respond as if it was a spiritual experience, because it was such a strong physical reaction that you go through. And also Serge is, adding his own suggestions into it as well. A lot of people were made very vulnerable by it. They had a very strong response to it. It seemed to change them and to bring them around to become believers. So some of the people who were there at that workshop that I went to are still in his cult. But to me, it was a technique. It was really a technique that Serge used to bring people under his influence.
Sure. One of the things I hadn't come across before that you referred to in the book was something I think you read on one of the cult information forums somewhere, was something called the idiot test. Just when you were speaking then, it reminded me of this. And that might be quite a derogatory way of putting it, but I found that absolutely fascinating and really rang true for a lot of the groups that I've looked into as well. I wondered if you could give a brief explanation of what that is.
The idiot test. So it's not an idea that I came up with. It's something I read on Rick Ross's Cult Education Forum by one of the contributors. And I think they called themselves anti-cult. So what they talked about, I think it's just a wonderful idea, really, is what a cult leader will do, and what I saw Serge do too, especially at the workshop I went to, is a cult leader, they'll bring in a group of people to an event, for example, and they'll talk absolute crap for a few hours. They'll just talk total nonsense. They might speak some sense. It's not all right, I shouldn't say it's total nonsense. It's probably a significant proportion nonsense. The rest of it might be some sort of charismatic stuff, or a little bit of wisdom chucked in here and there, but it'll be a bit of a mix. So what they do is they throw around all of these crazy ideas, and they don't hold back either, usually. So with Serge, he talked about the Arcturans being behind crop circles. Oh, I can't remember some of the other crazy stuff, but they talk this nonsense, and they know that a certain number of people within that group will reject it. So people who are not going to be susceptible to their ideas and their influence, their manipulation, will reject these ideas, and they'll probably go away and never come back. And that's what they want. They don't want critics. They want people who will go along with what they say. So the rational, critical people will run away very quickly, and the susceptible people will hang around. And the cult leaders, you see it in so many cults, they'll run the test all of the time, so that even when they have their followers, even when they've got hold of them, they'll continue to run that test and come out with more and more outlandish things. And they know they really possess people when their followers accept it and hang around and continue to just digest this nonsense that's chucked at them. So that's what the anti-cult was calling the idiot test. It's a test of who they can influence and who they can keep. And they don't just want anyone either. So with Serge, he's discerning in the sense that it's really useful if they have money, if they have some sort of disposable income that they can hand over to him. So that's a kind of important criteria. They need to be accepting, and they need to also have enough resources to be able to, keep him in the lifestyle he's become accustomed to.
Yeah, and I sometimes think with some of that stuff, I remember reading a bunch of Serge's writings and listening to some recordings, and the way that he speaks, the things that he speaks about, and the kind of the over-the-top language he uses all the time. I do think some of it is about bamboozling people as well, to kind of make them think that they are not smart enough to quite understand. He's got this superior intellect at the same time as limiting their diets and their sleep and kind of getting those critical faculties down as well. And on the money side of things, one of the other things in the book that I don't think I'd come across before, but I found really shocking, was the plan for to build an esoteric aged care facility, which, I mean... This, I guess, is off the back of the getting a lot of money willed to Universal Medicine and Serge through people who had died of various things. And I just thought, oh my gosh, that hasn't actually happened, has it?
Yeah, not officially, but from what I have heard, some of the followers have sort of set up in-home palliative care. So there is a bit of an industry of palliative care that occurs within the Universal Medicine community. You might have seen there was a Judith McIntyre case. This is a woman who died from cancer but left Serge this huge amount of money, and she was cared for in-home. But I have heard that wasn't an isolated case. And, in the years since the trial, well, over many years, a lot of family members of Universal Medicine members have confided that they suspect that their family, their loved one, has left a huge proportion of their estate to Serge. So I imagine that Serge will continue to receive bequests because he has an ageing clientele. He'll continue to receive bequests for some time yet. So that has become a major source of income for him.
Yep. Just zooming out entirely again, writing a book, as I am well aware, is no mean feat. And even once you've written it, getting it out into the world is another thing. So congratulations on such a huge achievement. What was it that made you decide to put all of this down into a book?
Right. So, well, I don't know. I think it's just such a great story. Above all, it's a great story, even though I'm in it. In some ways I wish I wasn't. But it's such a great yarn, it just had to be told. And I don't mean just because I'm in it, or Serge even, In some ways I think that Serge is one of the least interesting characters in the story. There's also my amazing lawyer, Tom Molomby, and he gets quite a bit of the spotlight in the story, but I think it's so well deserved. You can see your face. I think you agree. It's a great yarn. It's not just my battle against the Universal Medicine cult. It's this crazy courtroom drama. So it's a trial like you've never seen or heard of anywhere, where a cult leader goes willingly into a witness box and allows himself in an unprecedented way, because this is a guy who was very, very publicity shy, unless the publicity was positive, but, you know, he wouldn't speak with the media for years and years and years. And I thought that he would actually be too cowardly to go into the witness box in the end, but he did. He submitted to it, and he sat there for 5 days and got questioned by my lawyer. And, that's worth the price of admission, really. I just had to tell that story. In personal terms, in some ways, I would have preferred to just forget the whole thing and walk away from it and get on with my life, because it's not all happy memories. But, you can't walk away from such a good story either.
Yeah, of course. And I won't spoil it for any readers, but I mean, it's just even the lead up to Tom's opening question is kind of like it's teased out and you see it, and it's just fantastic. I want to talk a bit about the structure of the book on that note. To me, it read almost like a thriller by the end. The book is compelling all the way through, but it became an incredible page turner when it got to Tom Mollenby cross-examining Serge and your own time on the stand. So can you tell me a bit about your decisions around structure and presenting it to the reader in the way that you did?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the compliments, Sarah. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. And yeah, been getting good feedback. So thank you to everyone who's sent me the feedback. Yeah, the decision, I think it's a great drama, So I just think there was, at its heart, there's a really great yarn there and a great drama. And so it had to be written in a way that made the most of it, really. And I also thought that if I'd written it chronologically, beginning with, perhaps my first encounter with Serge and then ending with the trial, it wouldn't have worked. I just don't know if people would have hung in because no spoilers, but I intersperse the court scenes from the very beginning of the book. You start to read about what happened in court, and they're interspersed throughout the lead up. So it does work through the backstory as well. But I just thought that was the best way to do it, for readers to be able to understand the backstory and how that led up to this extraordinary trial. So yeah, that was just a technical decision of my own. It took a little bit of tweaking.
I thought it worked beautifully, and you must have had to do a lot of structural work making sure that did actually kind of play well together.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, because it took a long time to write. So I knew before I began writing that that's what I would attempt to do, that it would never be a chronological story, and that would be the only way to do it. And I don't know. When something takes that long, it's hard to sort of talk about decisions you made over such a long time. But that just seemed to be the most natural way to tell it.
How long did it take?
I don't know. I guess I started it in 2019 and I guess I finished it this year. So I guess you could call that 5 years, but there was a lot of intense writing over at least 2 years of the most intense writing, and then a lot of going back and editing. So lots of edits. So, yeah, I mean, who knows? It took a long time, but I hope it's worth it. I hope the product is worth it.
It absolutely is. At the end of the book, you revisit a custody case in the UK in which the mother referred to her rights to religious freedom under the European Human Rights Convention. In response to this, quote, "In matters of religion," wrote Lord Justice Jackson, "as in all other aspects of a child's upbringing, the interests of the child are the paramount consideration. The mother's rights to protection from coercion and to freedom of belief do not confer upon her the right to harm others." I think this point is missed so often in arguments about religious freedom and discrimination. And so I wondered, where do you see the balance of rights should be there?
I think the High Court justices over in the UK got it absolutely right. I have a feeling that judges here would probably make the same decision, the same call. And actually, I probably should say that there has been a number of successful family law cases in Australia since Benhayen versus Rockett, and since that case was decided in the UK as well. So that's one really great thing that's come out of Benhayen versus Rockett, is that it's really helped a lot of family law cases. And I hope, that means that it's kept a lot more children safer from universal medicine. But in terms of rights, look, the Justice has got it absolutely right. It comes down, I get impatient with the whole religious argument when it comes to cults, because I don't see it as a religious problem. It isn't. We all have beliefs, and some of them are better than others. The beliefs are not the issue, it's the actions. It's what people do. And if there's some ideas being propagated by a group that causes harm to another group, serious harm, then the ideas must be condemned. I don't care whether they're religious or political or other. The ideas need to be condemned, and the behaviour needs to be condemned, and the people who are the victims need to be protected. That's where the rights come in. So, I think there's a lot of obfuscation around religious freedom when we talk about cults, and a lot of cults are hiding behind the guise of religion. They call themselves religion, or they call themselves churches or sects or whatever you want. But their activities are antisocial. These things that these groups are doing, where they're exploiting people, where they're starving people, beating people, detaining people, where there's this plethora of abuses, would you consider those to be religious activities? So that's where I lose patience, because there's this inability to distinguish between something that could be called a legitimate spiritual practice or religious practice and just plain bad behaviour, bad, exploitative, harmful behaviour. And really, they should be so much more easier to distinguish. You should never be able to pass something off as religion. I think you saw in the book too that Universal Medicine sent a delegation to Canberra to a Senate inquiry hearing on religious freedom. And they talked, the delegation from Universal Medicine went there and whinged about how they were being persecuted. They weren't being persecuted about their religion. And they were talking about me, make no mistake. They were talking about me throwing shit at them online. But it wasn't religious persecution. I was criticising their antisocial conduct. I was criticising the harm they were doing to people. It had nothing to do with their religious beliefs.
Yeah, that's right. And I couldn't agree with you more. In Serge's defamation case against you, the jury found, amongst other things, that Serge Benhayen is the leader of a socially dangerous cult, and Serge Benhayen is a charlatan who makes fraudulent medical claims. Yet those who follow and promote his teachings remain licensed practitioners in a variety of jobs that can have a huge impact on people's lives. I mean, this is in the book, but I guess you would have hoped, and I would have hoped, that as a result of those findings, there would have been more ramifications, social ramifications and other ramifications for universal medicine. Can you just tell me a bit about the current status of universal medicine?
Universal medicine is still operating. Nothing has been done to stop it, even though there were findings that it is a healing fraud that harms people, and that it's an exploitative cult, that it had engaged in preying on cancer patients, that its leader had molested people, molested his clients. So it's still operating. One thing, though, is that they're doing less publicity. They've become more secretive. So this is, in some ways, the opposite outcome to what I wanted. I wanted to expose them. And, fair enough, I did expose them. I exposed their activities. But now they've become more secretive. So they're doing less publicity. They are still recruiting. They're just not open about it. They're far more covert about the way that they recruit. So their new recruits are a lot less likely to find out who they are exactly until they're deep in. The registered health professionals, mostly they have stopped openly endorsing universal medicine. So they don't do it in publicity so much anymore. But the majority of health professionals that were in universal medicine or involved in universal medicine before the trial of Ben-Hayan versus Rockett are still involved. So they're still having that influence on other members of the group that universal medicine is a legitimate organisation.
Yeah, and I guess we have to be clear that those findings are in a civil suit. They're not criminal findings, so there's not really action that authorities can take in terms of any kind of criminal behaviour.
No, you're right. Yeah, so no criminal penalties. However, and universal medicine also, its flock, they're in denial, really. They never acknowledged the findings of the Supreme Court. And if they did, they sort of said, well, that's the civil burden of proof, it's not the criminal. But the civil burden of proof is still findings of fact. The court found that these were facts. So, and it doesn't mean that they didn't find those facts were true to the criminal standard. It's just that they didn't have to find them to the, beyond reasonable doubt. They just had to find them on the balance of probabilities. Doesn't mean those facts are beyond reasonable doubt, though. So, yeah, I have to say there's still findings of fact, even though there's no criminal penalties.
Yep, absolutely. Well, we're coming to the end of my questions. And so from my end, to finish up, I wanted to read one of my favourite quotes from your book, which is just one of many that I highlighted as I went through. And it is this: believers in mysterious cabals or meddlesome spooks misidentify the sources of their anxieties, the real social inequities and dull old greed, incompetence and corruption of those in power that make life difficult for so many. Ben-Hayan's threat was not his hocus pocus, but his mendacity, callousness, and unscrupulous manoeuvring of money and manpower to cover up his underhanded activities. I think there are such understandable reasons that people turn to these kinds of belief systems. And as you've already said, the problem isn't so much the beliefs themselves, apart from how they do distract well-meaning devotees from focusing their efforts on society's true problems. But the real issue is the manipulative capacity of those at the top and their exploitative practices. I just thought you said that beautifully.
Really, that's in there because it draws parallels with so many groups and so much of what is happening in the world right now. There are so many people that are believing things that just don't have a basis in fact. And it seems that, I don't know if it's become easier. I don't know if people were always like this, but it's just such a pity that people are less trusting of legitimate authority, legitimate knowledge, legitimate facts. They're less trusting, but they will trust nearly anything else. And, what I was talking about there, it's QAnon as well. It's Scientology, it's QAnon, it's MAGA, MAGA. So it's so sad. I'd like to imagine there's some way out of this, and that, I don't know, people can find faith in better things. Find better places to put their faith. But facts have become so devalued these days. I just think it's really sad.
Yeah. It's something I think about an awful lot. I've seen family members kind of fall to all this conspiracy stuff over the pandemic, and it's been a really difficult thing to watch happen, and it's really hard to pull them out of that distrust in scientific methods and authorities. What we're seeing over in America around laws around the environment and that sort of thing, the experts not being able to take the decisions based on their expertise. I just think a lot more seems like it's about to go wrong before it hopefully goes right again. And we'll see if it's just a cycle or not.
I mean, why would you believe Serge Ben-Hayan over, legitimate scientists? It's just such a mystery.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there is something in, because we do see like the government is hamstrung by fossil fuel interests that aren't in the interests of the planet that is being destroyed. So you can see why people lose faith in these institutions, and it's just, the answer is not the Serge Ben-Hayans of the world. So it's such a tricky problem to grapple with.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point too, is that sometimes the Serge Ben-Hayans of the, my lawyer pointed it out as well, sometimes the Serge Ben-Hayans of the world are highlighting legitimate problems. It's just that their solutions are probably worse. Their solutions completely suck. So, they're not the answer.
They're usually about lining their own pockets rather than solving any of the problems in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, figuring out how to spot the charlatans. That's the thing we need to be able to do. Well, thank you so much, Esther, for your time today and for a fantastic book. There will be links in the show notes to where people can find it, and I highly recommend they get themselves a copy and have a read. It is a fantastic read, and just congratulations on it. And thanks for writing it and for everything that you've done.
Oh, you're welcome, Sarah, and thanks for inviting me on your amazing show. I've been a fan for a very long time, as you know. So this is something I really looked forward to. I didn't want to do it until I'd finished the book, so thank you for inviting me.
My absolute pleasure. You can get your hands on a copy of Universal Predator on paperback through Amazon worldwide, or ask your local bookstore to order a copy in for you and support small business. The ebook is available at Amazon, Apple Books, Kobo and others. The link to find it is in the show notes. My thanks to Esther for chatting with me for this episode. Thanks so much for joining me again for Let's Talk About Sects. As always, you can access ad-free episodes and support the production of this independent podcast via Patreon, or with a one-off donation or merch purchase. You can listen to my audiobook, Do As I Say, which is linked in the show notes, and grab yourself a copy of Joe Gould's soundtrack album, Nobody Joins a Cult, which you can also stream on Spotify. This episode of Let's Talk About Sects was written and researched by me, Sarah Steele. Original music composed by Joe Gould.